He was the most powerful man in the world, and the men who killed him were his own friends. This is the true story of Julius Caesar. So sit back, listen slowly, and learn English with the story of Julius Caesar. He was born in the city of Rome, around the year 100 before Christ. His family was noble and very old, but it was not rich, and it was not powerful. The Caesars were an ancient family with a proud name, but by the time young Julius was born, other families had far more money and far more influence. So Julius Caesar was born with a great name, but he would have to build his own power with his own hands. Rome in those days was not an empire ruled by one man. It was a republic. That means the city was governed by elected leaders and by a group of powerful men called the Senate. The Senate met to make laws and to guide the state. For hundreds of years, the Romans had been proud of this system. They had no king, and they did not want a king. In fact, the Romans hated the very idea of a king. Long ago, they had thrown out their last king, and they had promised themselves that never again would one man rule them all. Remember this. It is very important for our story. As a young man, Caesar was ambitious, clever, and brave. He was tall and pale with sharp, dark eyes. He cared greatly about how he looked and how he spoke. He was a wonderful speaker, and when he stood up to talk, people listened. But behind the charm, there was a burning desire. Caesar wanted to be the greatest man in Rome. He did not want to be just one leader among many. He wanted to rise above them all. When Caesar was still young, Rome was a dangerous place. There were civil wars and cruel leaders who killed their enemies without mercy. One such leader, a powerful general, decided that young Caesar was a threat and ordered him to obey. Caesar refused, and he had to run and hide to save his life. Friends spoke for him, and in the end he was spared. But even then, people could see that this young man had no fear, and that he would never simply bow his head. To build his career, Caesar needed two things. He needed the love of the ordinary people, and he needed money. He won the love of the people by giving them games, festivals, and grand public shows. He borrowed enormous amounts of money to pay for them, until he was deeply in debt. It was a huge gamble, but Caesar understood something simple and powerful. If the common people loved you, you had a weapon stronger than gold. Step by step he climbed. He held one public office after another, each one higher than the last. And to reach the very top, he made a secret agreement with two other powerful men. One was Pompey, a brilliant and famous general, loved for his victories. The other was Crassus, said to be the richest man in all of Rome. Together, these three men made a private deal to share power among themselves and to help one another. Historians call this arrangement the First Triumvirate, which simply means the rule of three men. To make the bond even stronger, Pompey married Caesar's daughter. With the support of these allies, Caesar was given command of a great army in the north, in a wild and unconquered land the Romans called Gaul. Gaul covered much of what we now call France, Belgium, and the lands around them. It was a land of forests, rivers, and fierce tribes. And it was here, far from Rome, that Julius Caesar would become a legend. For about 8 years, Caesar led his soldiers in the conquest of Gaul. These were the famous Gallic Wars. He fought battle after battle against the tribes of the region. He was a brilliant general, quick to act and full of clever plans. His soldiers adored him because he shared their hardships. He marched with them, he ate with them, and he knew many of them by name. He even sailed across the sea to the mysterious island of Britain, a place most Romans had only imagined. The greatest test came near the end. A young and brave leader of the Gauls named Vercingetorix united many tribes against the Romans. It was the largest rebellion Caesar had ever faced. The two armies met at a hilltop town called Alesia. There, Caesar did something extraordinary. He built a huge wall of wood and earth all around the town to trap his enemy inside. Then, when a second Gallic army came to attack him from behind, he built a second wall facing outward. His men were caught between two enemies, but they held. In the end, Caesar won, and the great rebellion was crushed. The conquest of Gaul was complete. Caesar wrote about these wars himself in a clear and simple style, and his books are still read today. Through them, all of Rome learned of his victories. He had become the most successful general of his age. He had a loyal, battle-hardened army, and he had glory. But he also had powerful enemies at home who watched his rise with fear. While Caesar was away, things had changed. Crassus, the rich third partner, had died in a distant war, and Pompey, once Caesar's friend and ally, had slowly turned against him. Caesar's daughter, the wife of Pompey, had also died, and so the family bond between the two men was broken. Now Pompey stood with the Senate, and the Senate feared Caesar. They saw a man with too much fame, too much money, and too loyal an army. So the Senate gave Caesar an order. "Give up your army," they said, "and come back to Rome alone as an ordinary citizen." Caesar knew what this meant. Without his soldiers, he would be helpless. His enemies would put him on trial and destroy him. He faced a terrible choice. He could obey and lose everything, or he could refuse, march on Rome itself, and begin a civil war. In the north, a small river marked the border of his command. It was called the Rubicon. By law, no general was allowed to bring his army across that river toward Rome. To cross it with soldiers was an act of war against the state itself. Caesar stood at the edge of the Rubicon and thought long and hard, and then he made his decision. He led his army across the water. As he crossed, it is said that he spoke 3 famous words. "The die is cast." In other words, the dice have been thrown, the risk is taken, and there is no going back now. The moment Caesar crossed the Rubicon, Rome was at war with itself. Pompey and many senators fled the city, for they were not ready to fight him. Caesar marched south and took control of Rome. Then he chased his enemies across the sea. The two great generals, once friends, now hunted each other across the whole Roman world. The final, decisive battle was fought in Greece, at a place called Pharsalus. There, though Pompey had more men, Caesar's veterans won a complete victory. Pompey fled the field. Pompey sailed to Egypt, hoping to find safety there. But the rulers of Egypt wanted to please the winner. When Pompey stepped onto the shore, he was murdered by men who hoped to earn Caesar's favor. When Caesar arrived and was shown the head of his old rival, the stories say he did not smile. He wept. Pompey had once been his friend and his son-in-law, and this was a cruel and shameful end. In Egypt, Caesar met one of the most famous women in all of history. Her name was Cleopatra, the young queen of Egypt. She was fighting her own brother for the throne. Clever, charming, and highly educated, Cleopatra formed an alliance with Caesar, and the two became lovers. With Caesar's help, she won her war and became the sole ruler of Egypt. Later, she would even travel to Rome to be near him, and she gave birth to a son she said was his. Caesar was now, without question, the master of the Roman world. He had defeated every rival. He returned to Rome in triumph, and the people welcomed him as a hero. And now, with all his power, he began to change the way Rome was governed. The Senate named him dictator. In ancient Rome, a dictator was a leader given total power for a short time during an emergency. But Caesar was not made dictator for a short time. In the end, he was made dictator for life. Caesar used his power to do many things, and some of them were wise and good. He gave land and work to poor citizens and to his old soldiers. He reduced the debts that were crushing ordinary people. He gave Roman citizenship to people in distant lands. He planned great public buildings, and he reformed the calendar. The old Roman calendar was a mess, out of step with the seasons. Caesar created a new one based on the sun, with 365 days and an extra day every 4 years. This calendar was so good that we still use a version of it today. The month of July is even named in his honor. But all this power came at a price. To many Romans, Caesar no longer looked like the leader of a free republic. He looked like a king. And remember, the Romans hated kings. Statues of him were raised. His image appeared on coins, something never done for a living Roman before. He wore special robes and sat on a special chair. Some of his supporters even offered him a crown in public. Caesar pushed the crown away, but many people were not sure he truly meant it. Fear spread among the proud men of the Senate. They began to whisper that Caesar wanted to make himself king and to destroy the republic forever. And so a group of senators formed a secret conspiracy to kill him. There were many of them, perhaps 60 in all. Some were old enemies, but others were men Caesar had trusted, forgiven, and treated as friends. Among them were two men in particular. One was named Cassius, a sharp and determined man who hated Caesar's power. The other was named Brutus. And Brutus was special because Caesar loved him almost like a son. Brutus came from a family that had once helped throw out the last king of Rome long ago. The conspirators told Brutus that he had a duty to his ancestors and to Rome to stop Caesar from becoming a king. In the end, painfully, Brutus agreed to join them. There were warnings. It is said that a fortune-teller warned Caesar to beware a certain day in the middle of March, a day the Romans called the Ides of March. Caesar's own wife had a terrible dream and begged him not to go out, but Caesar was proud and he did not want to look afraid. On that morning, the 15th day of March, in the year 44 before Christ, he went to a meeting of the Senate. As he walked, he passed the fortune-teller, and he said with a small smile that the day had come and nothing had happened. The old man answered quietly that the day had come, but it was not yet over. Inside the meeting hall, the conspirators were waiting. They gathered around Caesar, pretending to ask him for a favor. Then, at a signal, they drew hidden blades from beneath their robes. Caesar tried to defend himself, but there were far too many of them, and they came from every side. He was struck again and again. The most powerful man in the world fell to the floor at the foot of a statue, the statue of his old rival Pompey. The most famous part of the story comes at the very end. As Caesar looked up, badly wounded, he is said to have seen Brutus among the attackers, Brutus whom he had loved and trusted. And with his last strength, according to the legend, he spoke to him. "And you, Brutus." Then Caesar covered his face with his robe so that no one would watch him die, and he fell silent forever. He was about 55 years old. The men who killed Caesar believed they were saving the Republic. They thought that with Caesar gone, Rome would be free again and things would return to the old ways. But they were completely wrong. The people of Rome did not thank them. The people were angry and they wept for Caesar. His death did not save the Republic. Instead, it began a new and terrible round of civil wars. In the end, it was Caesar's adopted son and heir, a young man named Octavian, who would win those wars. He would defeat the killers of Caesar, and later he would defeat his last rivals, including Mark Antony and Cleopatra of Egypt. And then Octavian would take a new name. He would become known as Augustus, the first true emperor of Rome. The republic that the conspirators had tried to save was gone forever. The age of the emperors had begun, and it had begun because of Caesar. So what are we left with when we think of Julius Caesar? He was a brilliant general and a gifted writer. He was generous to the poor and merciful to his enemies, and yet he was also ambitious beyond all measure. He gave the world a calendar and a name that would echo for 2,000 years. Long after his death, rulers in distant lands would call themselves by versions of his name, hoping to borrow a little of his greatness. He rose higher than any Roman before him, and that, in the end, was the very thing that destroyed him. He reached for a power so great that the men around him grew afraid, and that fear turned the hands of his own friends against him. Thank you for listening, and for learning English with the story of Julius Caesar. If this story interested you, remember the man behind the legend, the boy from an old Roman family who reached for the whole world. Practice these words, listen again if you like, and we will see you in the next story.